In the throat of the Dust Devil Saloon, where the air was a thick, stagnant stew of stale whiskey, pungent tobacco smoke, and the sour sweat of desperate men, a soul's worth was measured solely by the cards held in a trembling hand. The lamplight, weak and jaundiced, clung to the rafters, painting the gamblers' faces in shifting masks of shadow and avarice. It was a place where hope came to wither, and where the law was often nothing more than the weight of the iron strapped to a man's hip. At the center table sat Jonah, a man who seemed hewn from the very granite of the Wyoming plains he worked. He was a silent monolith in a room of boisterous shouts and drunken laughter. His hands, mapped with the deep permanent stories of hard labor and unforgiving winters, moved with a quiet, lethal economy. He did not bluster, he did not boast. His silence was a palpable presence, a weight that bent the room's energy toward him. He played with the steady, rhythmic precision of a man who understood that in the West, patience was the only currency that never devalued. Across from him, Silas Stone was a sweating, florid canvas of impending ruin. His small, pig-like eyes darted frantically from his dwindling pile of gold coins to Jonah's impassive face, searching for a crack, a tell, a sliver of hesitation that simply was not there. Silas was a man who had bled himself dry. His land was mortgaged to the hilt, his prize horses were gone, and his last few dollars sat mockingly in the pot that Jonah had just raised with a flick of his calloused thumb. A collective, greedy breath was held by the circle of onlookers. The clinking of glasses stopped. Even the piano player, a man whose spirit had long ago been drowned in rotgut, let his fingers trail into silence. Silas's chair scraped violently against the grimy floorboards as he pushed himself back, a feral, desperate grin splitting his face. "I ain't done yet, Thorne," he rasped, his voice slick with a foul, trembling confidence. He fumbled deep within the lining of his stained coat and withdrew a crumpled, grease-spotted piece of parchment. He didn't just lay it down, he threw it onto the pile of coins with a flourish of pure malice. "I'm betting more than this pot. I'm betting a piece of property I brought in from the coast. A Chinese girl, unbroken, healthy, and worth 10 times what's on this table to the right buyer." The room fell into a new kind of silence, a cold, heavy vacuum. It was a silence thick with disgust, yet spiked with a dark, primal curiosity. Men who had killed for a handful of silver looked away, unable to meet the implications of the wager. In the darkest, dampest corner of the saloon, huddled near the back door like a broken-winged sparrow, sat a solitary figure. She was a specter in this world of loud, violent men. Until this moment, she had been entirely ignored, a shadow amongst shadows. Jonah's eyes shifted for the first time in an hour. His gaze moved past Silas's sneering face, past the leering onlookers, and landed squarely on her. He saw the glint of dark, terrified eyes peering out from beneath a tattered shawl. He saw the way she clutched a small, smooth stone in her hand, her knuckles white with the effort of holding on to the only thing she truly owned. Her name was Leanne, though to the men in this room, she was merely a worthless commodity to be bartered for a final hand of poker. Jonah's jaw tightened, a hard muscle feathering along his lean, weathered cheek. He felt a familiar, cold weight settle in his gut, the echo of an old debt to a world that had already taken too much from him. He was not a man who believed in the ownership of another's soul. He had spent his life carving freedom out of the wilderness with an axe and a plow. But in that heartbeat, looking at the raw terror in Leanne's eyes, he understood the brutal arithmetic of the moment. With Silas, she was a slave to a man who would break her spirit for sport. With him, she might be nothing at all, which in the hierarchy of the frontier, was infinitely better. "Call," Jonah said. His voice was flat, final, and carried the weight of a closing grave. He laid his cards upon the table. A king-high flush. The air seemed to leave Silas's lungs in a pathetic hiss. His face turned a bruised shade of purple, his mouth working silently like a fish out of water. With a roar of impotent rage, he shoved the table, sending coins and cards scattering into the sawdust, and stormed out into the night, leaving the foul stench of his failure behind. Jonah did not scramble for the gold. His movements remained slow, deliberate, almost mournful. He stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow that seemed to swallow the light of the room. He didn't look at the men who began to whisper and nudge one another. He walked straight to the corner where the girl sat. Leanne looked up at him with an ancient, bottomless terror. She expected the rough grip of a new master, the foul breath of a man claiming his prize. Instead, Jonah stopped 2 paces away, maintaining a respectful distance that felt like a shield. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and picked up her small, battered satchel and waited. The journey from the grimy, sin-soaked town to Jonah's ranch was a long, rattling prayer of silence. The wagon wheels groaned a constant, rhythmic complaint against the rutted track, a mournful song that scored the immense quiet of the high plains. The night was a vast, indigo sea, the stars overhead so bright and cold they looked like chips of ice scattered on a velvet shroud. Jonah sat at the reins, his back a rigid, unyielding line against the horizon. He did not attempt small talk. He did not offer empty reassurances. He knew that to a woman who had been sold like a head of cattle, words were just another form of deception. In the back of the wagon, Leanne huddled on a bed of dry straw, a small island of fear in a sea of uncertainty. She clutched the stone in her sleeve, her body jolting with every bump in the road. She watched the back of the man who had won her, waiting for the moment his true nature would reveal itself. The sun began its slow, brutal ascent, painting the endless sky in strokes of orange and violet, illuminating a landscape that was both beautiful and terrifying. It was a world of sagebrush and jagged rock, a place that mirrored the desolation in Leanne's heart. At mid-morning, Jonah stopped the wagon by a thin, struggling creek. Without a word, he climbed down, his boots crunching loudly in the silence. He filled a tin canteen and walked to the back of the wagon. He didn't try to hand it to her. He didn't want to force her to touch him. Instead, he placed the canteen on the wagon bed, a foot away from her, along with a small cloth-wrapped parcel of bread and dried venison. He then walked a considerable distance away to tend to the horses, his back turned, affording her a privacy she hadn't been granted in years. It was a small, insignificant detail, but to Leanne, it was a revelation. She reached for the water, her throat parched. The water was cool, and the bread was fresh. It was the first thread of a different color in the dark tapestry of her life. The ranch appeared just as the last of the daylight was being devoured by the mountains. It was not a grand estate, but it was solid, etched into the earth with a quiet, stubborn permanence. The house and the barn were built of dark, sturdy timber, the lines clean and honest. A well-kept fence enclosed a modest plot of land, an outpost of human order against the encroaching wilderness. The place felt exactly like the man himself, spare, functional, and deeply rooted. Jonah brought the wagon to a halt, but not in front of the main house. He pulled up beside a smaller, weathered cabin that stood a respectful distance away, nestled near a cluster of cottonwood trees. Smoke curled lazily from its stone chimney. Jonah had clearly ridden out earlier that week to prepare it, perhaps sensing the turn the cards would take. He climbed down, his movements stiff from the long journey. He lowered the tailgate and looked at her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "This is yours," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that hadn't been used for much more than commands to horses in a long time. He gestured toward the small cabin. "There is food inside. Fresh water in the pail. The door has a heavy iron bolt on the inside. Use it." He didn't wait for a thank you. He didn't linger to see her reaction. He turned, unhitched the team, and led the horses toward the barn, his silhouette melting into the deepening shadows. Leanne stood alone in the immensity of the Wyoming night, the only sound the deafening thud of her own heart and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. She walked toward the cabin, her steps hesitant. Pushing the door open, she was met not with the cold damp of a prison, but with a wave of warmth from a fire already burning low in the hearth. The space was a single room, but it was spotlessly clean. A simple cot was made up with a thick, hand-stitched quilt of deep blues and reds. A rough-hewn table stood in the center, and on it sat a fresh loaf of bread, a wedge of sharp cheese, and a tin cup. It was a place of preparation, not imprisonment. She immediately went to the door and tested the iron bolt. It slid home with a satisfying, heavy thud. For the first time in a journey that had spanned an ocean and a continent, Leanne felt the air reach the bottom of her lungs. From the small, frost-etched window, she could just make out Jonah's silhouette on the porch of the main house. He wasn't looking toward her cabin. He was sitting in a high-backed chair, a solitary figure watching the stars emerge over the ridge. He sat there like a silent guardian over a world he had just, for better or worse, claimed as his responsibility. That night, behind her bolted door, a fragile seed of something other than terror began to push against the cold, hard soil of Leanne's soul. She lay on the cot, the warmth of the quilt heavy and real, and listened to the wind. It no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like the beginning of a long, uncertain freedom. The days that followed fell into a slow, deliberate rhythm, dictated by the immutable laws of the sun and the seasons, rather than the erratic whims of a master. A new language began to form between the main house and the small cabin, a language built not of spoken words, but of gestures, shadow, and a profound, respectful silence. Each morning, long before the first bruised light of dawn touched the frost on the window panes, Leanne would hear the rhythmic, heavy crunch of Jonah's boots in the snow outside. He never knocked. He never called out. When she eventually gathered the courage to slide back the iron bolt and crack the door, she would find a wooden pail of fresh, warm milk and a small basket of eggs nestled on her porch. It was a silent provision, a daily testament that she was seen and cared for, yet owed nothing in return. From the safety of her window, Leanne watched him. At first, her observations were born of a hard-learned survival instinct, a constant, flickering surveillance for any sign of impending threat. She looked for the tightening of a fist, the sudden flare of temper, or the predatory prowl she had come to associate with men of his station. But as the weeks bled into one another, the nature of her watching began to shift. She studied the way he moved through his chores with a relentless, focused energy that bordered on the meditative. He mended fences with a painstaking patience, his large hands surprisingly deft as he worked the stubborn wire. She saw that he spoke more to his horse, a low, melodic murmur of comfort, than he had ever spoken to her. She watched him pause in the middle of the yard, his head tilted back as he stared at the distant, jagged mountains with a look of such profound, melancholic stillness that it made her own chest ache. He looked like a man who was listening for a ghost that had long ago stopped calling his name. Inside the small cabin, a tentative life began to unfurl, much like a wildflower pushing through a crack in the desert floor. Leanne found a small, rusted knife in a kitchen drawer, and with it, she began to reclaim a piece of herself. She would sit by the hearth in the evenings, the firelight dancing in her dark eyes, and carve. She worked with the scraps of pine Jonah left by her woodpile, turning the raw timber into things of ethereal beauty. First, a small, perfect sparrow with its wings half furled, then, a mountain lion with a tail that seemed to twitch in the flickering light. Her artistry was a quiet rebellion against the ugliness. She had endured a declaration that her hands were meant for more than just toil. She also began to tend to the land immediately surrounding her dwelling. Using a sharpened stick, she cleared a patch of earth and began to nurture the few wild herbs she found growing near the creek. Her knowledge of plants, a forgotten fragment of a life lived a lifetime ago across the sea, returned to her in whispers. She found a quiet dignity in the work, a sense of ownership that was not about property, but about purpose. Jonah's silence was not one of neglect, but of a rare, radical respect. He was giving her the one thing no one else ever had: space. He was allowing her the time to realize that the cage door was not just unlocked, but gone entirely. The brutal, white-hot heat of the late summer began to soften, its edges frayed by a cooler breeze that whispered of the coming autumn. The constant, gnawing fear that had lived in the pit of Leanne's stomach for years began to recede, leaving behind a fragile, watchful peace. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the clouds in hues of fire and bruised rose, Leanne saw Jonah sitting on his porch. He was mending a leather strap, his broad shoulders hunched, looking remarkably small against the vast, darkening sky. He looked lonely. It was a realization that struck her with the force of a physical blow. A decision, swift and clear, formed in her mind. She picked up her latest carving, a hawk, caught in the moment of taking flight, its wooden feathers so delicate, they looked as though they might flutter in the wind. Holding the carving, which was still warm from the heat of her palms, she walked out of her cabin. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her step was steady. She crossed the packed earth that separated their worlds, the distance feeling like a bridge over a great canyon. Jonah looked up as she approached, his hands instantly stilling. He didn't stand, but his eyes were alert, tracking her movement with a quiet intensity. She stopped a few feet from the porch railing, the silence between them filled with the rhythmic hum of crickets and the immense, cooling breath of the plains. She held out the carving. Jonah looked at the hawk, then slowly lifted his gaze to her face. "This isn't needed," he said, his voice rough and low, sounding as if it had been dredged up from a deep, unused well. It wasn't a dismissal, but a simple statement of fact. He didn't require payment for her safety. Leanne did not retreat. She took another step forward, her chin lifting slightly. She reached out and placed the carving on the railing beside his hand. "I pay my way," she said. Her voice was quiet but firm. Her English precise, a secret she had kept hidden even from Silas. It was a declaration. She was not a dependent. She was not a prize won in a game. She was a woman of agency, settling a debt not with him, but with her own dignity. Jonah stared at the small wooden hawk for a long time. He reached out a calloused finger and tentatively touched the curve of its wing, his expression softening into something she couldn't quite name. Then, he reached into the breast pocket of his worn, sweat-stained shirt and pulled out a crumpled, yellowed piece of paper. It was the deed Silas had thrown onto the poker table. He didn't look at the words written upon it. He stood up, walked to the small stone fire pit near the porch, and dropped the paper into the glowing embers. They both stood in the gathering twilight, watching as the edges of the parchment curled, blackened, and dissolved into a wisp of gray smoke that drifted up toward the first few stars. The ink that had defined her existence as property vanished into nothingness. He turned back to her, his face illuminated by the soft, orange glow of the dying fire. "There is no deed," he said, his voice clearer now, anchored by a strange, new strength. "There is no debt owed to me. Not now, not ever." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "You are free, Leanne. Truly free. You can leave whenever you wish. I'll hitch the wagon myself and take you as far as you need to go." He let the words hang in the air, a gift of unimaginable weight. Then, he added, his voice dropping to a note of gruff, honest concern, "But the winter comes soon. The high passes will be closed within the month, and the roads are not safe for a woman alone. You are safe here. Stay, if you choose." And with that, he turned and walked into the shadows of his house, leaving her alone with the word safe echoing in her mind, like a melody she had forgotten how to sing. The burning of the deed did not bring a sudden, joyous celebration. Instead, it brought a silence even more profound than before. To Leanne, freedom was an idea so vast and foreign that it was almost paralyzing. For years, her life had been a series of smaller and smaller boxes. To be told the door was open was to be faced with a wilderness more terrifying than any enclosure. She retreated to her cabin that night and slid the bolt home. She realized then that she wasn't locking Jonah out. She was locking the familiar version of herself in, trying to understand if she still remembered how to exist without a master. The next morning, the shift began in earnest. When Jonah left the milk on the porch, Leanne was already standing there, waiting. She didn't retreat inside when she heard his boots. She watched him, and when he looked up, she gave a short, single nod. Later that afternoon, the autumn wind, a wild and restless spirit, tore a section of shingles from the roof of her cabin. Jonah emerged from the barn with a ladder and a handful of nails, his movements purposeful. He didn't ask permission, he simply saw a problem and set about fixing it. As the rhythmic thwack-thwack of his hammer rang out against the wood, Leanne emerged from the cabin. In her hands, she carried a tin cup of steaming tea, brewed from the wild mint she had dried. She set it on the porch railing near his ladder. Jonah glanced down, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his weathered features. When he finished the repair and climbed down, he picked up the cup. It was still hot, the steam curling around his face. He took a long drink, looked at her over the rim of the tin, and gave a nod of his own. It was the first stone laid in the foundation of a bridge. They were no longer a man and his worthless prize. They were two solitary souls, cautiously navigating the space between them. Unaware that the coming winter would demand more of them than they ever thought possible. The winter did not arrive with a gentle dusting of white or the soft chime of bells. It descended upon the high plains like an invading army, a sudden and violent blizzard that swept down from the jagged peaks of the Tetons, swallowing the world in a blinding, chaotic tempest of white. The wind, which had once been a restless whisper, now howled with the ferocity of 1,000 hungry wolves, rattling the heavy timbers of the ranch house and threatening to strip the very earth from its foundations. Inside her small cabin, Leanne was a prisoner of the storm. For 2 days, the world was reduced to the flickering orange glow of her hearth and the terrifying, incessant scream of the gale outside. The cold was no longer a mere presence, it was a physical entity, a cruel, invisible blade that seeped through the cracks in the logs, through her thick wool blankets, and into the very marrow of her bones. On the third day, the cough she had been nursing since the first frost worsened, turning into a deep, rattling rasp that tore at her chest. A fever set in, swift and merciless. Her forehead burned like a brand, and her vision began to blur, the familiar outlines of her sanctuary twisting into grotesque, shifting shadows. She shivered uncontrollably, her small form looking terrifyingly fragile against the backdrop of the storm's fury. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her delirium. She knew the logic of the frontier to stay here, alone and burning with fever while the woodpile dwindled, was to invite the long sleep. Bundling herself in every layer she possessed, her fingers fumbling with buttons that felt like ice, Leanne fought her way to the cabin door. The moment she slid the bolt, the wind tore the handle from her grasp, slamming the heavy oak against the outer wall with a sound like a gunshot. She lowered her head, shielding her face with her tattered shawl, and pushed out into the maelstrom. The world was a suffocating void of white noise. She could barely see the main house, a faint, blocky shadow through the swirling drifts that had already climbed to her waist. Each step was a battle of attrition. The snow fought to pull her down, to bury her in its soft, lethal embrace. Her lungs burned with the intake of frigid air, and her heart hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. By the time she reached Jonah's porch, she was no longer walking, she was crawling, her hands numb and useless. She collapsed against his heavy front door, her fading strength spent on a single, desperate thud of her shoulder against the timber. The door swung open almost instantly, and Jonah filled the frame. He was a towering silhouette against the warm, golden lamplight of the interior. He took in her snow-caked form, the unnatural flush of her cheeks, and the desperation in her glazed eyes. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need words. He simply reached down, lifted her into his arms as if she weighed no more than a bundle of kindling, and kicked the door shut against the howling dark. "Sick," she managed to whisper, her voice a fragile thread that snapped in the warmth of the room. Without a moment's hesitation, Jonah bypassed the guest rooms and carried her directly to a cot he had already pulled close to the great stone hearth, in the center of the house, the very heart of his world. He worked with a silent, efficient intensity. He stripped away her frozen outer layers, wrapping her in heavy buffalo robes that smelled of wood smoke and old cedar. For the rest of that night and into the gray, flickering light of the next day, they became a silent team in a shared vigil. Jonah knew the lore of the land. He brewed a potent, bitter tea from willow bark and dried rose hips to fight the fire in her blood. He moved with a grace that belied his size, tending the fire, pressing cool cloths to her brow, and sitting in a high-backed chair just a few feet away, his presence a solid, unyielding anchor in the storm. Leanne, drifting in and out of a feverish haze, accepted his care with a quiet, bone-deep trust. In the deep, hushed hours of the second night, as the blizzard reached its crescendo outside, the silence inside the house grew heavy and honest. Jonah was staring into the embers, his face carved with a deep and ancient sorrow that the firelight only served to emphasize. He spoke then, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "My wife," he began, the words coming slow, as if they were being pulled from a place of great pressure. "Mary." Her lungs were never strong. The winters they were hard on her. The last one took her before I could even get the wagon out of the yard. It was a piece of himself, raw and unvarnished, offered up in the darkness. He looked at Leanne, and for the first time, she did not see a savior or a man who had won a bet. She saw a man who understood the crushing weight of loss, a man who bore the invisible scars of a life that had demanded too much and given back too little. "I built this house for a family," he said, his gaze returning to the fire. "And then I lived in it like a ghost for 5 years. I thought the silence was what I wanted. I thought it was the only way to keep the pain from finding me again." Leanne reached out a hand from beneath the robes, her fingers pale and trembling. Jonah hesitated, then reached out and took her hand in his. His palm was a map of hard labor, calloused, rough, and immensely powerful, but his grip was as gentle as a summer breeze. In that touch, the invisible wall that had separated their houses and their lives finally dissolved. When the blizzard finally broke on the fourth morning, it left behind a world transformed, hushed, beautiful, and buried under a pristine shroud of white. The immediate danger had passed, but something fundamental had shifted within the walls of the ranch house. Leanne's fever had broken. And though she was still weak, the light had returned to her eyes, a light that was no longer guarded by the shadows of the saloon. Jonah insisted she stay in the main house, his reasoning spare and practical. The cabin roof needed repair. The house was warmer, and he didn't want her trudging through the drifts to get her morning milk. But the unspoken truth was that their separate existences had ended. They were now a single, strange household, bound together by the memory of the storm and the shared warmth of the hearth. A new, unspoken language began to flourish in the quiet of the ranch. Leanne, as she regained her strength, began to leave her marks of care throughout the Spartan home. She found Jonah's late wife's sewing basket tucked away in a dusty chest and began to mend his worn shirts, her stitches small and perfect. She brought a subtle, rhythmic warmth to the kitchen, the scent of her cooking spiced with the herbs she had dried, chasing away the lingering ghosts of solitude. Jonah, in turn, began to show her the inner workings of the ranch, not as a master instructing a servant, but as a partner sharing the burden of the land. He taught her how to oil a harness, his large hands guiding hers, a brief, electric touch sending a jolt of recognition through them both. The romance between them was not a thing of grand gestures or flowery declarations. It was a slow burn, nurtured by the comfortable silence of two solitary souls beginning to find their orbit around one another. It was in the way he would pause at the door to watch her work, and the way she would look up and smile, a genuine, radiant smile that made the winter-worn house feel like a palace. They were no longer survivors of a storm. They were the architects of a new world, built on the ruins of their shared desolation. The fragile piece of their new life was shattered, not by the return of the snow, but by the arrival of two riders. They appeared on the horizon as the last of the slush was retreating, two dark blots against the vibrant, emerging green of the spring meadows. One was the sheriff from the neighboring county, a man whose soul was as dry and dusty as the legal ledgers he carried. Beside him sat Silas Stone. He had come back, his face a smug, proprietary mask of avarice, his gaze fixed on the house with the predatory air of a man coming to collect a debt he believed the world owed him. Jonah met them on the porch, his large frame placing him squarely between the visitors and the front door. He didn't carry a rifle, but his presence was immense, a fearsome wall of silent defiance. Behind him, through the glass of the window, Leanne watched, her hand clutching the curtain, a cold, familiar dread snaking its way up her spine. "Thorne," the sheriff said, his voice dripping with a false, oily geniality. "We've come on official business. Mr. Stone here has filed a formal claim. Says you're holding his property." Silas grinned, a foul, yellowed expression. "A contract's a contract, Jonah. Won her in a game. Fair and square. Just took me a while to get the law to see it my way. Now, move aside." Jonah's face was a mask of stone, but a dangerous, low-burning light had kindled in his eyes. "There is no property here that belongs to you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that carried more menace than any shout. The sheriff's eyes flickered past Jonah, catching sight of Leanne in the window. "I see her right there. The law says she's his. Don't make this difficult, Thorne. You're a man of the land. You know how titles work." In that moment, something inside Jonah broke, not his control, but the dam that had held back the protective rage he had buried for a lifetime. He took a slow, deliberate step off the porch and onto the frozen earth. "The only law on this land is me," he said. "That deed was settled the night you walked out of the saloon. What is in my house is my family. And you are not welcome in my home." As he spoke the word family, the front door opened. Leanne stepped out, her back straight and her head held high. She did not hide behind Jonah. She flanked him, standing as his equal, her face pale but resolute. Silas's bravado faltered. He had expected to find a broken girl and a lone rancher. He had not expected this united front, this silent declaration of belonging. He looked from Jonah's cold fury to Leanne's unyielding gaze, and saw not a piece of property, but a queen defending her castle. The sheriff, a bully who preyed only on the weak, recognized a fight he could not win without a cost. He wasn't willing to pay. He spat on the ground, his face contorted in a sneer. "This ain't over, Thorn." But the words were hollow. They wheeled their horses and rode away, their retreat marked by a cloud of dust and the impotent fury of men who had mistaken kindness for weakness. Jonah did not watch them go. He turned to Leanne, his eyes fierce and protective, softening instantly as they met hers. He slowly raised a calloused hand and brushed a stray strand of dark hair from her cheek, his touch gentle, reverent. It was a promise, a vow, and a declaration, all delivered without a single word. As the last of the winter's ice melted, it fed the parched creeks and softened the stubborn earth, and the world was reborn in a fragile tapestry of gold and green. The word Jonah had used, family, settled over the ranch like a benediction, as real and tangible as the sturdy roof over their heads. The love between them was the steady heart of this new world. It was found in the way he brought her the first wildflower of spring, its petals a delicate, defiant purple, leaving it on her pillow for her to find. It was in the way she mended the collar of his favorite shirt, her fingers brushing his neck, a touch that spoke volumes of the peace they had found. One warm afternoon, as the scent of pine and thawing earth filled the air, Jonah led her by the hand to a place she had never been, a small, sheltered meadow guarded by a grove of ancient cottonwood trees. A simple wooden cross stood at its edge, weathered by years of sun and snow. This was her favorite place, he said, his voice soft, stripped of its usual gruffness. Mary's. She would sit here for hours just watching the light change on the ridges. He was not just sharing a location. He was sharing his heart, his past, and the space he had finally allowed to heal. He knelt in the tall grass and retrieved a small, dust-covered wooden box from a hidden hollow. He wiped it carefully with his sleeve and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a tarnished silver locket. He didn't open it. He simply held it in his palm, the metal catching the afternoon sun. "I buried my past here," he said, looking up at her, his eyes clear and full of a profound, unwavering love. "But you are my future, Leanne." He set the box down by the cross, a final, peaceful farewell to the ghosts of his grief. He stood and took both of her hands in his. He had no ring of gold, no flowery words polished by poets. He had only the truth, spare and honest as the land itself. "Stay," he said. "Build a life with me, not because of a debt, and not because of a game, but because I don't want to see the sun rise without you ever again." Leanne looked at this man, her protector, her partner, her family. She saw the years of solitude and pain that had carved the lines on his face, and she saw the deep, abiding goodness that shone from his soul. She raised one of his calloused hands to her lips and kissed the knuckles, the skin rough against her mouth. "This is my home," she whispered, her answer a vow that echoed through the quiet meadow and up toward the mountain peaks. They stood together as the sun began its slow descent, their shadows stretching long and joined across the new grass. Two solitary figures who had found their harbor in one another, their future now as vast and as promising as the endless, golden western sky. The worthless girl and the lone rancher were gone. Replaced by a king and queen of a wilderness, they had tamed with nothing more than the quiet, defiant power of a love that refused to be broken.